Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the black swan, and more specifically, a black swan event. But in order for us to understand a black swan event, we have to kind of understand where this concept came from. So a long time ago, people were just under the assumption that whenever you came across a swan, it was always white, especially in Europe. There were tons of white swans. Then in 1697, a European explorer visited Western Australia and came across, to his shock and disbelief, a flock of black swans, thus interrupting his paradigm, causing a paradigm shift in his mindset, that the idea that all swans were white was quickly erased, because now he came across a black swan, and the guy's name was William de Vlaming, the guy's name, the explorer, so you can look him up. So then afterwards, the expression black swan event came about because people realized that perhaps there were more things that we do not know about than we actually do know. And you can go through history, you can study history and go, you can look at it and go from point A to point Z and then say, okay, now that we know this is how history has been for the past 2,000 years, we can now predict the future. And in Nassim Taleb's book, The Black Swan, he goes opposite of that. He said, just because you have history in the books, that doesn't necessarily mean you can now predict the future. Just as in the case of this European explorer, because you come across a white swan every day for like 100 days in a row, that doesn't mean that there is not an existence of swans that are black. So you come across a white swan today, tomorrow, the next day after that, and you write down your little hypothesis. 3 days in a row, I have discovered white swans, therefore that is what all swans look like. And that's how people used to approach swans. There's only one color. Until there isn't. Until that one day where you discover that there is a black swan. So when it comes to things like the rapture and stuff, I'm going to be 99% wrong when it comes to pre-tribulation rapture until I'm right. So what do I mean by that? Like, you can easily argue and say the rapture isn't going to happen right now, today. You can even argue that it won't happen tomorrow or the next day or the next day. Why? Because you're using current data and you're saying, well, the rapture hasn't happened for the past 2,000 years, therefore, ergo, it will not happen in the future. And that's how people approach things. They say Jesus Christ hasn't come back, therefore he cannot come back for at least 7 years based on their data because he hasn't come back. So they just look at it this way, and I think it's a mistake, because it only takes, you could be right for 1,000 days about something, but it only takes 1 day for you to be wrong, and then everything changes. Your whole paradigm changes overnight. Same thing with 9/11. I mentioned in another video of people, I mentioned that people did not predict that 9/11 was going to happen. Now you can argue and say, oh, it was an inside job, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But you can only make that argument because now you have the puzzle pieces to work with. Now you can piece everything together and go, oh yeah, this looks like it was planned, it was an inside job, whatever it is. But you're doing it after. And that's one of the 3 criterias of a black swan event, is people start to fixate on the idea that it was totally predictable. That's the 3rd criteria. The first one is it has to be highly unpredictable. Second one is it has to be highly impactful. And then the third one is we use hindsight bias to look back in time and then piece all the things together. So it's the same thing when you're putting a puzzle together. You go downstairs into the basement and you see a puzzle. It's like, okay, there's 1,000 pieces. So you take off the cover and you look inside, and it looks like there's about 1,000 pieces, but let's be sure, because we don't want to start building this puzzle and then realize that there are missing a few pieces. So you count every piece and you're like, oh cool, there's 1,000 pieces here, we are good to go. You put the cover up and you start looking at it, and you look at, okay, there's some blue, there's some trees and all this kind of stuff, and you start piecing the puzzle together, because you're like, okay, 1,000 pieces, that matches everything is good to go. Halfway through your day, you're really struggling. You're about 8 hours into putting this puzzle together, and then you realize, man, there's a lot of green in this puzzle, but in that picture there's a lot of blue, and in fact there's a lot of sea and all this stuff, but here I'm finding, looks like branches and trees and all this kind of stuff. And then you start realizing that this puzzle is very difficult, until somebody walks by and says, hey, that is the wrong puzzle. Somebody must have mixed up the cover, because what you're doing is this puzzle over here, which is with sailboats and all kinds of stuff, but what you're working on is a forest with some animals and stuff on it. Here's the cover. So now you have the complete picture. You were working on the wrong puzzle, but now you have the cover that matches these puzzle pieces, and now you can go, oh yeah, now this is easy, I could start piecing the stuff together. Why? Because you got the correct information now, but if you don't have the correct information, it's going to be very difficult to put it together. 9/11 was almost impossible to predict beforehand, unless you are on the inside, but then it's not a prediction. I'm saying massively, on a mass scale, most people did not see it coming. They could not predict it. And this is why I say the rapture is one of the greatest black swan events to happen. It's kind of a paradox in some ways, because it was talked about in the Bible, especially in 1 Thessalonians 4, but yet people are like, no, it can't happen, cannot, will not, never will happen. There is no such thing as a pre-tribulation rapture until it happens. And then obviously, because the church, the body of Christ, is in heaven, it's pretty tough to go, oh, see, I was right and they were wrong, or vice versa. I was wrong, you were right, all that kind of stuff, because everything has changed now. So that's why I say 99% of the time when you're predicting something like this on a massive scale, you're going to be wrong most of the time until you're right, because again, it only takes one time to be right. So right now you look around and you go, yeah, it's impossible for Jesus Christ to come back until he comes back. And then all of a sudden you have to recalibrate. And I believe the Antichrist knows that this is going to happen, this event, and is preparing to have an explanation for people as to why millions of people have disappeared almost overnight, or why their bodies have just crumpled over and it looks like people are dead or asleep. Meanwhile, we've been raptured to heaven. So that's my humble opinion. Hopefully that explains a little bit more about, again, what a black swan event is, where it came from. And this, again, this is how I've built my channel, because we could very well be in a black swan event. And again, part of the criteria of being in a black swan event is you don't know you're in it until you're out of it. And then you look back and go, oh yes, we were definitely in it. So that's the difficulty of having, or of being inside a black swan event, is pretty much you won't know you're in it. That's the difficulty. And again, with the rapture, that's a bit of a paradox, because we've been told ahead of time that the Lord is coming back for us, for his church, for his body, his flesh. And it's just up to us to be watchful, be mindful, be on alert, have our hearts open to him every single day, as though he could come back today. So hopefully you got something out of this. If you have, subscribe to this channel, and feel free to leave a comment. See you later. Bye for now.